This question, though very simple, maybe not one that we really consider very often, is quite important to address, and hopefully I can bring some suggestions forward about why it is the case. Mark sent in an email asking a question that nobody seems to address or answer. Why don't all watches have screw-down crowns? I see no advantage to push-pull crowns, and only advantages to screw-down. Is it really that cost prohibitive? I personally am willing to pay whatever marginal increase in cost of a watch with a screw-down over a push-pull, and I know many other people would too. And he ends with the final question: can't these giant companies not shell out slightly more for a vastly superior function? And it's a brilliant question, Mark. Thank you for sending this in. It's also a difficult one to address. I guess the way we can start is by looking at the history of the screw-down crown, which many of us would assign to Rolex and their patenting of it in 1926 or 27, I believe. This was done exactly at the same time when we saw the oyster case becoming very popular, and how the now famous Mercedes Gleitzer used the Rolex around her neck as she swam across the English Channel, making history. That's how Rolex made their name, the waterproof case. Many other companies were doing the same thing. We look at brands like Panerai in the 1930s. But between then and the 50s, there didn't seem to be much development in this area, really. We notice how field watches became popular, how pilot watches became ever-present. Everything was simply manually wound, no screw-down, push-pull, and that was just the way things were. Once we hit the 1950s, we started seeing this huge surge in sports watches. The war being over and companies starting to experiment with new technologies, as the world was. People were becoming more active, more recreational, so we saw the rise in popularity of scuba diving. Mountaineering became a huge thing, the Everest descent. Sports car racing started becoming more and more popular for amateurs and professionals. All of these different areas required watches for their specific standards, and they were all built to fill these purposes. Not many brands were experimenting with screw-down crowns apart from Rolex. It seems like the screw-down crown has always just been synonymous with the brand name. And it is quite impressive when you think of it that way, that a brand has been so pioneering in this area and still continues to use the same approach. Maybe they improve their watches very glacially slow next to their competition, but the way they have set the standard kind of has trickled into every other area of the watchmaking industry. I believe that there were many issues with copyrights and patents back in the day when it came to screw-down crown technology because brands like Rolex owned the rights. Many had to do with other peculiar approaches like Omega using what they called the Naiad lock system, which essentially was a valve and a set of gaskets that only sealed the best the deeper you went into the water. The more back pressure on the crown, the better it held. So at lower levels, when you had just gone into the water, the watch was quite prone to damage. We look at the areas of chronographs and how they have been completely forgotten about, used predominantly for, like I said, timing racing. I guess in many ways, now and then, it has to do with the application that the watch is intended for. Many manufacturers, we can look at the brands that focus on traditional aesthetics like Patek, Breguet, all of those big names. They don't create watches with screw-down crowns because they don't expect their wearers to suddenly decide to go swimming in the sea with them. Traditionally, the dress watch has always been worn with a tuxedo, with a suit, and not taken anywhere near water. And I guess there is this divide where you're looking at brands that are trying to stay true to their heritage and keeping what they know and remaining with what they understand, but at the same time they are limiting themselves in many areas. Some of which are trying to evolve their sports lines to incorporate things like screw-down crowns and water resistance. You'll be surprised to know that many sports watches, even though they're rated at something like 30 meters, can be taken into the water. I've heard stories of watches like the Omega Speedmaster, one that we would never even consider taking near water, being put in water, being worn, not being operated, but it still works perfectly fine. What the screw-down crown does, of course, is give us that assurance that you're not going to get any kind of water ingress or damage to the watch and its internal components. We've seen how many field watches today still don't use screw-down crowns, but have amazing gaskets aligned inside, which allows you to use it in the water up to 50 meters and beyond even. So if we have to break it down, why is it that we need screw-down crowns? What is their purpose? What's their base function? More than anything, it is just to protect the watch's movement and to be sure that no water enters the case. But the crown is not the only place where water can enter. In fact, you might be surprised to know that water generally can affect the casebacks of these watches a lot more. There is a much greater surface area for water to enter. So putting sports watches aside and focusing on the more high-end pieces with the fancier complications and the more traditional sizing and all of those aspects, most of them haven't been rated for any kind of water resistance because the possibilities of water ingress is huge. A lot of these components are handmade and hand-finished. They're not punched and stamped out of machines. When it comes to making things like custom threads for extremely precious metals like gold or platinum, also looking at things like material purity and the percentages that go into making these alloys. Too much or too little of something can make the material weaker, and all you need is one thread to be misaligned, and all of a sudden the water will just flow in. So I guess in many ways it's wrapping your head around and trying to understand that the sports watch has always been built for being something that is multi-purposeful. The dress watch, on the other hand, which is an area that I think you're asking about the most, is one that has never been intended to be used in these kinds of environments like, I don't know, rock climbing, hiking, swimming. We can draw a fine line and say that these traditionalist brands are trying to stay true to their past heritages, and just remember how important this is for the manufacturers themselves. Could it mean then, if you introduce a screw-down crown to a Patek Calatrava 5196, that the whole movement has to be manipulated because the crown stem has to be longer? I think in answering your question it is can, but won't, because the manufacturers don't deem it necessary to make their watches waterproof. In order to get these kinds of certifications, the watches have to pass all forms of testing too. Those kinds of standards are difficult to keep, on top of movement accuracy and regulation and everything else. An important aspect to address, I think, also is manual winding. Going back to traditional approaches, these pieces never needed a screw-down crown because manual winding was so important every day. And we see that with a lot of these classical, traditional pieces, they don't have automatic movements. And the ease of being able to wind the watch without pulling out the crown makes it a much more pleasurable experience for the end user. It's just incredible to consider how far the screw-down crown has gone. It has influenced every area of the watchmaking field, from entry level all the way up to the highest tiers. There is something so assuring about screwing down a crown and knowing that it is safe, and not have to worry about anything external influencing it. So these are just some of my thoughts around the area, very much an open-ended ramble. I'd love to hear your thoughts around the subject and what you believe the reason is. Is it just because watchmaking tradition, especially in the higher tiers, says no? Is it because in order to achieve this, they have to fulfill many other standards when it comes to certifying the watch's usability? Or is it just because they don't want to do it because it's unnecessary in many ways, costly and quite difficult to do? There's a lot around this area to discuss, and I highly doubt we would ever be able to solve the problem or come up with a clear solution. So in many ways, we could consider this to be a new chapter in the watchmaking scene. And maybe this aspect alone will have a much greater influence down the line. That you could take it anywhere and not have to worry about any external factors. No. External... What's a good word? I'm a lost for words sometimes, you know.